If I could, just a point of clarification, though, do you in the research community have any efforts underway, for example, to think about how to collect pain information in a standardized way? Or do you have a dozen different instruments or 2 dozen? And is it worth trying to think about how to have that dialogue? Because I think if we're going to routinely collect, or if it's going to be embedded in personal health records or even information you get from the patient and incorporate in the EHR, it would just be a whole lot easier to do that if it's possible to reach agreement on common scales and approaches to measuring it.
Right. So, if there's one data element that we should do a better job of including in the clinical record that impacts on it, it's smoking history. Tobacco smoking impacts just about every disease. It's never well recorded in the clinical data set. You talk about outcomes, and if you don't, and we've documented it's not well controlled and well documented in terms of particularly whether they quit, start, and it has a huge impact on just about every disease. So if I would just say one element that would have almost universal use that would help in outcomes measurements would be smoking history. But I think, Janet, the point that you make is interesting about, and it really crosses that where does clinical care become research, and it's playing out at Hopkins. I'll tell you, for example, let's say, let's take, quality of life measures, functional measure, whatever. So the group says, geez, why don't we would like to, we're going to have a research protocol that collects that data on everybody that's been in the intensive care units, because we're interested to see, what's a prediction of who gets through, what's their status. Then that gets incorporated right into the EMR. Then you start saying, well, that's one group, that's one particular issue, but why don't we go across the system to try to do that? And it is an issue, at that point, we have these debates. Well, is that a research protocol, or does that become a clinical care standard? Where does it cross the line? When do we need to ask people? And there's actually, even when we talk about helping the researcher, it is we don't do a great job of in the clinical side, we don't do a great job of standardizing who reports that, and how it's done. So you have to standardize that measurement a little bit. And then you can put alerts in the EMR that says they're due for a quality of care or a quality of life measure. You put that in, next one up, you try to do that. We are having debates like, do you put that up for somebody where they just happen to show up to the provider who's not that interested, when the next week they're going to they actually have an appointment for the doctor that's really been doing this over time and is most interested in how to do it. But I think these are opportunities we've never had before, and we're going to have to go through this decision point about what's research, what's clinical, when does it get done, and who's going to have access and aggregating that data too.
Thanks very much. These are wonderful questions. We're getting the part of the program, though, we're going to need to shorten the questions and the answers in order to get through and provide an opportunity for those who are online. And Steve Schwartz, feel free to chime in. And when the panelists respond, if you'd please identify yourself so that people online or on the phone will know who's speaking. Kevin?
I have so many questions.
So little time.
So little time. Because this is really great. I guess I'll make a general question that I'd like to hear the group's response on, including Steve on the phone. There's this debate in the industry about aggregating data into a single database for research purposes, and should there be an entity that does that versus having the information accessible either through some web services and where research can actually search across databases and pull information together versus an aggregation of that data. I'd like to hear the panel's view on whether it's because of privacy, security, or technical reasons, business reasons. I heard Steve say also that someone needs to pay if we're going to upload information into some of these other systems. Who's going to pay? Who benefits? And there's a question in my mind about why would someone have to pay of sharing patient data if there are standards to where this information goes? What's the business model that suggests that there's an additional charge for actually sharing, the data that's already been collected? So just in general, aggregation versus actually distributed type of databases, and then business models that who would pay, in Steve's point about for sharing of this information. Ooh, it's a tough one.
I'll take a shot at that.
All right.
Steve Ruberg here. I don't think there's any way we're going to for all sorts of technical privacy reasons or whatever, to come to fully integrating, all of this data. I think the key is the data standards and the data exchange standards. I firmly believe that we need to get down to granular data element standards, and sometimes it's as simple as you call it gender, I call it sex, you code it 1 and 2, and I code it M and F. And the amount of time that we spend in the industry, the pharmaceutical industry, when we work with EHRs, or try to work, just simply mapping that information is absurd. It's billions of dollars. So I would say everybody can do whatever you want within your company, but as soon as you move it outside your company to somebody else, it's got to adhere to this standard, and that's the thing that we all agree to. And you don't have to worry then about everybody transforming their systems or trying to integrate data. You have a distributed model that's facilitated by data standard exchange.
I'll just say, realistically, at some point the data sets are big enough. This is Dan Ford from Johns Hopkins. I mean, at some point the data sets are big enough, and the issue about aggregating to the millions. I mean, remember we do this when we do research on the CMS data sets. We're taking a very tiny sample. If you need 1 million records to find an effect, it's probably not a very big effect. So I do think, at some point the size of the data set is not as important as the quality of the data within it. But the same thing, I mean, you can go to a lot of time and effort to create a giant database, which the added value of that over some of the smaller ones, if you can access and even replicate it, is, I think you have to wonder.
Thank
Kevin, this is Steve Schwartz. What I was referencing earlier with respect to who pays was more along the lines of the initial integration work between EHR and EDC systems as opposed to access to data. I think, once aggregating data and the ability to bring data together, that's a pretty straightforward process, and that is something that can be accessed without, with clear clear stakeholders who are either are trying to access data and need to pay for it, or it's a different issue altogether. Interoperability between EHRs and EDCs and bringing that together, because pharma is paying for the EDC systems and providers are paying for the clinical systems, as opposed to the issue of being able to access aggregated data, which I think is a pretty straightforward process, and that there are a lot of, I think, pretty sound and simple business models in place today for that to work.
Thanks very much. Michael Ardier?
Yes, thank you very much. And I appreciate the presentations. It's enlightening for me to tie some of this stuff together. My questions are around subjects, and I guess the question is, why are there so few subjects for clinical trials? I know from the health center world, we treat a number of uninsured minorities, and health centers are looking to get involved in clinical trials, and their patients would get into want to get into clinical trials because there are opportunities for them for treatment that they otherwise don't have. And what's stopping, I guess, the provider world and the research world from coming together and actually being able to identify those subjects? And then the other question is around, I think, Dan, you identified that there's a need for increased confidentiality with clinical trials. And is that coming from the patients or from the researchers, the need for the extra confidentiality?
Well, this is Dan Ford from Johns Hopkins. I mean, the clinical recruitment issue is a complicated one, obviously. And it's not just, I think first you have to solve the simple question is, does a provider and a patient at the time they're seeing each other have a list of the clinical trials for which they may be eligible? That's sort of the simplest thing. And, to the extent that, in a EHR, you would have a pop-up, that comes up when you're seeing a patient that says, here are the trials, you're eligible, and then remember, and even in terms of the HIPAA issue about how you engage that patient, it'd be perfect because then the provider, who is their clinical provider, can say, here are 5 trials. Is it okay if the research coordinator for those trials contacts you? Yes. So I think if we ever, that would be kind of the holy grail to get to nationally to solve the simple question, the simple issues. That doesn't solve there's both the public perception issue. So public data would show that although the American public says they value clinical research and it's helped someone in their family at the 90% plus rate, over years there's a sample that have been asked, if you were asked to join a clinical trial, how likely would you join? And those have been dropping. And that has to do with issues of trust and confidentiality. And again, I think it's like any of these confidentiality issues. Frankly, it's a minority, and that's why you need that research to tell you. I mean, I'll give you an example. I told you about this clinical research billing issue. So we have a group that comes in for a clinical trial on a cardiac rehab, and they're not really formally patients of Hopkins. They come in, the consent form says, participation in this study will be free, and everything will be provided. And then when we ask them, well, we want to clear your insurance, and they said, well, why do you need our insurance? My insurance? You just told me everything was free. Now that's part of us getting in the system and make sure. So whether I don't think it's everybody, but it's a group that begins to say, wait a second, I don't want to incur any financial liability being in the system. So why do you need to know that? And the other real science issue, the way we're going, is that the sort of the blockbuster drug. I mean, we always use the breast cancer example, but it's a pretty good one, right? So there aren't drugs for every woman that have breast cancer anymore. It's only for those that have a certain receptor and certain possibilities. So the number of eligibility requirements that you're seeing for clinical trials are not as broad as they used to be. So now someone's coming in and they may, that's great, our EMR says they have breast cancer, but now you really have to go through a 30-minute assessment to determine, is it the right type of breast cancer, what is their previous treatment, and that's just where the science is going. So you're going to have to, this matching at a level which probably the EHR is not going to help us, is something that we need to look at.